Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. Today's video is about the challenges of working with shirts as quilting fabric, and I'm going to offer you some solutions as well, and I have a lot to say about it. So stay with me. I've been talking about shirts for quilting fabric for a while now, as you know, and it's no surprise that I like it and have a lot of great things to say about shirts. But I would be remiss if at some point I don't talk about the fact that there are some challenges working with shirts. And this is going to be one of those things where, as I start talking about some of the challenges, if you have not already used shirts, you might be like, ooh, no. And that's okay. I mean, using shirt fabric in your quilting may not be for everybody, but I myself am a fan. I not only use the product, I'm also the president. Isn't that what he says? I mean, there just are challenges. There's challenges with working with quilting cotton. So of course there's going to be a challenge working with shirt fabrics. But I have found some solutions to some of the more common problems, and so I thought I'd share with you. The challenges with shirt fabrics loosely shake out into three categories. The first and the biggest probably for most people is time. And then there is working with the fabric itself and just the differences there between shirts and quilting cottons. And then there's the design component. So patterns, color, choosing the colorway. So that's kind of where we're going, those three categories. Paul is fantastic, and we'll put chapters in, so if you don't want to hear about one particular one, you can skip, and that's okay. I understand. So I want to start by talking about the time that's associated with getting your shirts to the place where it's just like using fabric. Of course, I have a pile of them. This represents almost nothing of the shirt stash that I have. But there is the washing component. So, you come home with quilting cottons from the local quilt store, and unless you're a pre-washer, which some people are, you really can just kind of go for it, start cutting and rolling. With thrift store shirts, that first you have to wash it, which takes a little bit of time, and then break them down, and then fold them up into some sort of usable order, and then cutting them in prep for your cutting. To start with, I want to say the washing component, and I'll get into specifics of like stains and smells in the fabric category. But what I have found is I come in from the thrift store with a bag of shirts, and I usually just go straight to the washer and put whatever I can together and just go in and wash them. I have found that if I just like drop it here in my sewing area, it will stay there for a while. And then I forget about it, and then I forget about it. And then when I go to do something, I'm like, oh, I need to wash these shirts. And then, oh, I wish I had had that shirt for this last project. So if you go in and wash it just immediately or as soon as possible, put them in the laundry, I have found that then doesn't tie up any mental energy with a bag of shirts. The biggest time and the biggest challenge is breaking shirts down. And so getting them from this into those pieces of fabric that are very, very much like a fat quarter. And a lot of people have commented over the last year and a half that I've had this channel, gosh, it takes so much time, or then you have to break it down. Like that is a reason to not use shirts. For me, it's really no different than doing hand binding, sitting on the couch watching TV and binding a quilt, or embroidery, or cross stitch or crochet or knitting, all of which I have done and do, it's handwork. Now, it's reverse handwork, it's deconstruction, not construction, but it can be a very enjoyable, meditative type experience and give me something to do with my hands. Now, let me stop and say, do you remember Jeff Foxworthy, the comedian that did the "you might be a redneck if someone accused you of lying through your tooth"? If the thought of, sitting in the evening watching TV and taking a shirt apart that feels like too much time for you, then this is not for you. So if you think then shirt fabric may not be the thing. But for a lot of us, this is actually can be very relaxing. I will say if I get too many shirts, which is currently the case for me, it can feel a little overwhelming. And it's not because it takes so much time, because honestly, I can really take a shirt apart in 15 minutes, especially if I'm paying attention, 30 if I'm really into a show. But it just feels like a lot. And so one of the ways around this that I have found, besides recruiting Paul to help me, is if I will do like only buttons, just take all the buttons off of a slew of shirts. So if I have 10 shirts and I just take all the buttons off and I have no other intention than just to take the buttons off, and then I feel really accomplished. It's almost like what chain stitching is for sewing and quilting. It's creating a batch situation. So taking all the buttons off, or buttons and collars and cuffs, or just some piece of the process, and do that with a whole bunch of shirts. It has a much greater sense of accomplishment for me. So that is a solution that I've found. It doesn't really shorten the time, but it makes me feel productive in that time, in the same way that getting a whole side of a quilt hand bound in an evening. So there is that is a solution to that. Another solution is to have good tools. Actually, let me stop. I'll be right back. So another solution to the time that it takes to break down shirts is having really good tools for your shirt breakdown process. Now, you can do it with anything. So don't hear me say you have to have super fancy scissors. But if you have tools that you enjoy that feel good in your hand, I have found, so I am now praising these scissors. Paul got me these for Christmas. They're Guggenheim scissors, and I tell you, it cuts through a shirt like butter. And I find myself looking for a reason to use them. And so, and it has that when it goes through a shirt. So I have found that I'm more eager to break down my shirts now because I have that. In addition, having a very good sharp seam ripper, which I call a seam reaper because of a misspeak in one of my very first videos. So I call it a seam reaper. This one actually needs to be replaced. I was using it last night and I was having to really work at it. And I was like, yep, it's gotten dull. It's time for a new one. And then I use my really sharp all the way to the point scissors to do buttons. You can do it with a seam reaper, but the scissors to me work better, and I can just motor through it really quickly. So that helps with both the time and the enjoyment factor. So again, if for you that feels like ugh, then shirts may not be for you, but it can actually really be an enjoyable process. Some of it is the way you approach it in your mind, and the other is having good tools and a process for working with it. And that reminds me of a sub-challenge, a challenge of a challenge, which is when you take your shirts apart, it creates a lot of detritus, and then you have to figure out what to do with it. Let me show you what I'm talking about. It's a lot. So here I have, let me move these out of the way. So in this tote are seams that I have cut from shirts that I have saved. And in this tote are cuffs and collars from the same said shirts, and you'll notice it's full. I'm about to need to do something with it. I have my button jar for my ivory and cream buttons, and then I have recently sorted my buttons, and I now have colored buttons in a baggie, black and gray buttons in a baggie, and brown buttons in a baggie. Clearly, I've broken down a lot of shirts. This part of the process for some people is burdensome because what do you do with the seams and cuffs and collars and buttons? And I will do a video on that, so we're not going to take all the time today. But the idea there is that for those of us that like to thrift, we tend to not waste. And so it feels wasteful to just chuck all that. And let me just give you permission. This shirt is on its second life already, and you may be rescuing it from a landfill to begin with. So if you're one of those people that you're like, I can't, and I mean can't, you can throw those away and feel okay about yourself because you probably have saved that shirt from the landfill. But I will do a video later on some things that you can do with them. I personally am using my seams currently to knit a rag rug. So there are all kinds of ideas there. But for some people, that is a hurdle. Like, what do I do with all this? My answer to the buttons is I am collecting them. And I haven't done anything with them yet. So, but that is a challenge. You end up with a lot of kind of remainder stuff that you may or may not know what to do with. The last is probably not the last, but the last I'm going to talk about in the shirt breakdown and time process, or dealing with shirts from a time standpoint, is the folding and getting it to a usable place in your fabric stash. And I want to show you that, so you'll have a solution maybe for the time that it takes. So once you get your shirt broken down, you end up with this. For example, this is a shirt back. And for quite some time when I started using shirts and quilting, which is from the very beginning, I had all these pieces of shirts and really no good way to store them. And I spent a lot of mental energy and time trying to come up with what to do with these shirt pieces. So I want to show you really quickly a good way maybe to fold them so that you don't have to spend that time and energy. Once I'm done breaking a shirt down, sitting on my couch watching Shogun, what I'll do is I just take whatever my shirt piece is, fold it in half the long way. If it's very big, I'll fold it again. And then I fold it in half, and then I fold it either in thirds or in half again. And what that gives me is this. And this very much, I hope, looks to you like a fat quarter, because it is very close to the size and shape of a fat quarter. And you do not have to do this system. But once you have a system, the time that it took prior will be reduced greatly. Just because then you know what you do with your shirts, you have a plan, and you can just pop right through it. But initially, if you're just getting started using shirts, the time spent trying to figure out what to do with those pieces is not insubstantial. Whatever it is, find a system, and then once you've broken down your shirt, just go ahead and fold your pieces. And then now you can move on with your life, and you have a nice little thing to go in your fabric stash. So that's really the parts of the shirt breakdown process that add time, which is really the biggest challenge. But there are also challenges that have to do with the fabric itself. And so I'd like to go over some of those with you and offer a few solutions. Not every challenge can be solved, but let's start with the smell, stain, and ick factor. So clearly I'm starting with the solutions rather than the challenges in this category. The reality is sometimes shirts from the thrift store come with undesired stains and smells. And so I was just going to hit the highlights for you of how I deal with that. Now, if you are a germaphobe, you may not want to buy shirts at the thrift store. What you may also find, and this really is a hard stop for some people, There are a lot of shirts that have been washed with heavily scented detergent or fabric softeners. And if you have allergies to strong scents or perfumes, this may be a contraindication for you, truly, because I have discovered even if I wash them greatly and soak them and wash them on hot and all that good stuff, sometimes as I'm breaking down a shirt, I'll cut a seam and the kind of stored perfume from fabric softener or highly scented detergent will just come literally like wafting right up in my face. Just be forewarned, that's a possibility. But for the just standard stuff, I have discovered these various products that I have before me. For every shirt that I buy from the thrift store, I wash it on warm or hot, usually hot. And I usually do a significant amount of vinegar. And you see the size vinegar that I have. And I have 2 of these, and they live next to our washer. So I literally fill the wash basin and just go like glug, 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 like I just pour to a count of 3 or 5 or whatever. And what that will do, it eliminates most smells, to be honest with you. It also strips any of the like formaldehyde or any of those coatings that make shirts wrinkle free or just come from the manufacturer with a coating on it. Now, sometimes it comes out not as slick and therefore not as soft, but most shirts, it makes them feel and behave more like quilting cottons. I do use a lot of OxiClean if I have shirts that are stained, and I do soak them for a fair amount of time. I also pre-treat with the little OxiClean spray, but I'll tell you, your best friend is really Dawn dish detergent. So anything that looks like a grease stain or smear, a lot of times on the backs of shirts, like in the neckline or in the very top of the yoke. I mean, we have oils in our skin, and that a lot of times is what doesn't want to come out. So if you will wet your shirt, put some dish detergent on it, it literally does exactly what the commercials say. It breaks up grease and oils and will get your shirt really super clean. And then if you have a particularly smelly or strong odor in a shirt, that is not necessarily a reason to leave it in the thrift store, although if you do, I won't judge you. But a viewer suggested this to me. It's called Odor Cleanse, and it's ODORKLENZ. I'm not paid for this. There is no sponsorship for this. She just suggested I try it, and I bought it online, and it works so beautifully. So you do a couple of scoops, and it soaks, and I don't know, it's magic. It takes the scents out. So if you are a person who the thought of stains or smells has kept you from working with shirts, here are some solutions for you. And again, there may not be a solution if you just really are totally grossed out, and that's okay. I still love you. So while we're in the fabric category, let's talk about thin shirts, and then we'll talk about all the different types of fabric. So thin shirts can be a real challenge. I get lured into them all the time at the thrift store because very often they're also very soft. They're tricky because they've been worn, and so they're soft. Now, thin doesn't necessarily mean threadbare, and I think some of you have had that experience. There are certain quilting cotton manufacturers, Liberty, for example, the fabric itself is just thin. So this is not really so much a comparison, and I have a whole video on thin fabrics if you want a really big set of solutions. But I have found this one is probably the biggest offender that I have. It is so soft, but it is so thin, I can almost see through it. And that is the case with a lot of shirts. So I've actually had to be really choosy, and that's one of the things you need to think about when you're purchasing shirts in the thrift store is it soft? Check, yes. Is it super thin? So One of the things that's a solution for that is you can starch it heavily before you use it, because once you get it sewn into your quilt top and then batted, backed, and bound, all the B's in quilting, it usually is not a problem. Now, you do need to look for threadbare. You don't want to do something that's threadbare. Thin is okay. Threadbare is not okay because it will tear as it's washed and used in the quilt. But it is a challenge working with very thin shirt fabrics. And so you do have to make some accommodations with interfacing or starch or whatever. In that same category is shirts that have been dry cleaned excessively. They feel so good. And a lot of times they're a very tight weave. Because usually those are men's professional shirts. But when you go to take them apart, if you are a person who likes to seam rip your seams out, I have found that seam ripping with a shirt that's been dry cleaned maybe overly or just a lot, it will just literally tear right through the shirt. And sometimes if you're used to doing that seam rip situation where you go like that, you'll go right right through the front of the shirt. So do a little test patch, just especially on the button placket for some reason. So do a little bitty, test it. And then if it seems like it's going to grab and tear, your best bet is to use your scissors to cut out those seams, because you might find yourself ruining a whole shirt front. Trust me, how I know this. So that's thin fabrics. And again, if you are interested in really a deep dive, I have a video on thin fabrics. Next up is shirt types. And of course, I have a lot to say, but I'll try to be brief today. So I have my little stack of shirt types. The first one, and it's the one that people ask me the most about, is cotton poly. I have two examples of that. This one is, you can almost tell by looking at it, it has a sheen on it, and so it's not 100% cotton. This one is also cotton poly. It's more cotton than poly, and I have washed it on hot, and so it looks far more up close like a quilting cotton. Both of them pose some challenges, and largely has to do with not holding a crease and what it does under the needle when you sew it. So it's very, very common with cotton poly shirts that they'll slide when you sew them, and they don't like to be folded. Which, if you've done any quilting, when you're pressing seams open, pressing seams to the side, it's kind of important that that does what it's supposed to do. So if you put heat on it, it goes that way and then it stays that way. With cotton poly, that is not necessarily true. And so that is a big challenge when you're both purchasing your fabrics and when you're working with them in a quilt. You need to know that it's not going to behave like a quilting cotton. And gosh, I feel like I'm going to say this with every single fabric, but I have a video on cotton poly shirts that's, again, it's a deep dive on what you can do to manage that. So that would be the solution, is in that video. But moral of the story, it comes down to starching and pinning and knowing what it's going to do, which is really the case with all of the shirt fabrics. If you have worked with them and you start handling them and know what you're dealing with, it does not preclude you using them in a quilt, but it does mean that you have some accommodations. And so my next one, to that point, this beautiful seafoam, this is an Oxford cloth shirt, and Oxford is a very specific thing. Again, have a video on that. They fray terribly. Ravel. I don't know why I said that 3 times. Ravel. They fray, and so they benefit greatly from starch, and you need to know that going in, that one of the challenges of working with Oxford, a lot of times the threads that are in the fabric are very big. And so if you lose a thread or 2 or 3, all of a sudden you're very close to your seam allowance. So it's something you have to take into account. My favorite, which is linen, and I've talked a lot about it lately because I'm working on some linen quilts. Same. It ravels and frays. It shrinks after it's been washed, and so you have to kind of know that going in. And a lot of times it's an open weave, so it will give and shift when you're piecing. And so if you starch it, or if you just kind of know that factoring in, then suddenly it's not a challenge. It's just the way the fabric behaves. And once you understand that, it's really not a challenge at all. In fact, I would say, I actually said this today, initially when I was working on my orange peel quilt and I used linen in curves, I had a lot of swear words with that, and I'll never do curves in linen again. I've actually come to amend that opinion. It may be actually the perfect fabric for curves, but it's one of those things you have to know what it's going to do and factor that in, because it does stretch and then it does draw back up when you wash it. So that's an example of a fabric that its biggest weakness is also probably its biggest strength. But knowing that going in will help you take it out of the challenge category and into something else. Flannel, which a lot of people love to make flannel quilts. They're cozy and soft, but flannel can be very flimsy and stretchy. It has also a lot of give. So if you're going to use it on the bias, that can be a challenge. And again, with all of these, there are ways that you can work around it, whether it's pinning, starching, interfacing them, fusible web, all that sort of stuff can make it the biggest difference. This gorgeous fabric, which I just couldn't stand, I had to put it in the category, is actually a teeny tiny whale corduroy. And I haven't worked with a lot of corduroy. I have a friend who is also a patron on Patreon, and she uses a ton of corduroy, but it behaves its own way. And then this one has a sheen and is directional. And so sometimes when you have fabric with a nap, or if it's got a sheen on it, and or if it's directional, that can pose some challenges in your quilting. And then last but not least, this is actually not a challenge. This is a reminder that sometimes you get shirts that are just exactly like quilting cottons. It's not really so much a challenge as it is just each fabric has its own characteristics. And when you sew with them, so for example, if I were to put this corduroy together with this quilting cotton, they're going to do different things as they're being pressed and as they're being sewn. And if you're not prepared for that, then quilting with shirts may not be for you. The last thing in our fabric category, well, it's not the last, but it's the last one I'm going to talk about, is the biggest challenge to me in the fabric category is that you have a limited amount of fabric. So, for example, I love this fabric so much, and it was a short sleeve shirt, and that's all. I think this might be the front. That's all that's there for the front right side. And so most shirts will give you very close. If they're a medium or a large or bigger, they'll give you very close to a yard of fabric. But then that's it. And so that can pose challenges. For example, if you miscut yardage, you generally can order more unless it's out of print or, limited run or whatever. But with shirts, you have to be very judicious in your use of it. And also, there's not a lot of wiggle room for if you miscut your fabric, because that's all you've got. And there's not a workaround for that. There's not a solution. It just is a challenge. You've got what you've got. So that's something to consider. And I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't bring that up. Again, back in the category of the biggest strength is also maybe its biggest weakness. To me, that's a delight, because that means that the quilt that I make with this shirt will be one of a kind. The downside is there isn't any more of it if I just love it, and want to use it in another quilt. And that parlays nicely into our next category, which is the design aspect of working with shirts. And so let's talk about that. So I've talked about this before, maybe excessively, on the channel, which is not every pattern works for shirts because of that thing that I just said, which is there's a limited amount of them. So what that means is that choosing a pattern can be a little more challenging because you have to factor in, this is the fabric that I have and this is all the fabric that I have. For me, that is kind of like the challenge in the throw down the gauntlet and let me show you. But I'm really unusual that way. Not everybody wants to really be challenged. Like picking a pattern is hard enough, but then also adding in, oh, and you only have this amount of fabric to work with, which is part of the reason why I do those great quilt pattern videos, so that as I try them and discover, hey, this is actually great for shirts, there are some, suggestions and options there. But it is a challenge. And in that same vein, with regard to a pattern, it's not maybe as easy to follow a pattern using shirts because you can't follow the cutting instructions if the pattern happens to have them, because you're not going to have a yard of fabric that you can do that flop, 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 and then just zip through it. I will say one really useful solution for me with that, the cutting instructions, is once I get a straight edge on really any piece of shirt, so whether it's sleeve, front, back, if I get a good straight edge, after that it's not as hard as you might think. It is a challenge, but it's just not as difficult as you might think. And I have also talked, maybe excessively, about laying out a piece or a piece of your block to try to get a sense of how to cut your shirt in such a way to maximize the fabric. I think those of you that are garment sewists also, or who have done other crafting where you're cutting unusual shaped pieces out of fabric, this is not as big of a challenge. In fact, this is probably nothing for you. I mean, if you're used to making a dress, for example, or a skirt, the piece may be all kinds of crazy and you lay it out and pin your pattern and cut it out, and then what's left is kind of a crazy mess of fabric. So using oddly shaped pieces is really not that hard for garment sewists to get their head around. Those of you that have only used just yardage and you're used to cutting those nice 2.5 inch strips or a 5 inch strip or whatever, there's a little mental hurdle there for sure. But I would say that starting with like get a straight edge, and then you just kind of treat it like it's yardage. Also, a challenge is figuring out what you need from your shirt pieces. So, for example, for those of us that use shirts, you kind of have to go to the end of the pattern instructions and figure out what you need for each block and then work backwards, which is also, that's the challenge is the solution. The challenge is you have to go to the end of the pattern and work backwards, but that's actually also how you beat that challenge, is you just figure out what you need in each block and then work backwards, and that generally does the trick. And then kind of an outworking of that, and to the point of cutting pieces out of for example, if you were garment sewing, the scraps are not really uniform. So you're not going to come out of working with a shirt with strips that you can cut them down to 5 inch blocks or 2.5 inch strips. But a lot of times they're very weird, oddly shaped pieces. And that's not really a reason, I don't think, to not work with shirts, but it is something that you kind of have to, if you're new to this and you're wanting to get into using shirts, you kind of have to go in knowing not going to end up with a lot of big, straight, nice, square pieces in your scrap bin. It's gonna look a little more crazy than that. And lastly, and again in the strengths, also the weakness category, for me this is not a challenge. I love it. But for some people, not having a curated group of fabrics is a challenge. So for example, I grabbed all of these shirts just to show you the different types of fabric in shirts. And this is not all of them, obviously, but these were not meant to go together. And it's obvious that they were not meant to go together. Whereas if you were to buy fabric from a line, they're meant to go together. And so you can mix and match, almost like Garanimals in the 70s for children's clothes. You don't have to worry about picking a fabric and this doesn't go. With shirts, if you do what I do and you just buy the shirts that you like or the ones that feel nice or have a fun print, you might get home and end up with this right here. And then you're really not going to make a quilt out of these things. And so then it's a matter of mixing and matching your shirt fabrics with your fabric stash, which for some people is a legitimate challenge. If you're not used to pairing colors together or prints and solids or any aspect of that, then it can be a challenge. So you have to approach your shirt choosing a little differently, either thinking of what you have in your stash as you're shopping, or when you're looking at fabric bundles or you see someone's quilt pattern that you really like, identifying, oh, I could use my peach shirt and my brown plaid shirt, and that would look really pretty together. So you just kind of have to think about it differently. I've done some various videos on fabric pulls and just kind of going into it like, what if I did the fall season colors? What if I did winter season colors? Or, you have 6 or 7 fabrics and then just using your shirts to kind of fill in the gaps, or vice versa. So that one, if it's a challenge for you, the solution may mean using your color wheel. It may mean looking at other people's fabric bundles and kind of imitating that with the shirts that you have. So it's not necessarily an easy solution, but it can become, instead of a challenge, really the challenge in the good way, like a fun thing to try to put together your own colorway with your shirts. So quite a few challenges to working with shirts, but not any of them, I think, so awful that it keeps us from really having a good time using shirts. I hope it's been helpful for you, for me to identify some of the challenges and maybe pose some solutions to those challenges. And I hope that you'll take the plunge and work with shirts in your quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thank you so much for watching.